That night, the bells of Hagia Sophia rang for the last time in 1,000 years. Tonight, we journey back to one of history's most profound and haunting moments, the final hours of Constantinople, when the last Byzantine emperor stood watch over a dying empire, when ancient prayers echoed through marble halls for the very last time, and when the world itself seemed to hold its breath. So settle in, dim those lights, maybe light a candle to mirror the flickering flames that once danced across the great city's walls. Let the soft sounds around you fade into the distant whisper of history calling. Take a deep breath. Feel yourself settling into the story that will carry you through the night. We begin our journey on the evening of May 28th, 1453, as twilight settles over the golden domes and ancient stones of Constantinople. Chapter 1. The Emperor's Burden. The sun hung low over the Bosphorus, painting the water in shades of amber and deep copper. From the highest tower of the great palace, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos watched the light fade from his empire, just as he had watched the light fade from so many other things during these past 57 days of siege. The air that drifted up from the city below carried the scent of incense from 100 churches, mixed with the smoke of cooking fires and something else. Something that made his chest tighten with each breath, the smell of endings. Constantine...
Gentlemen, this is where we make our stand. The eastern pass is our only viable option for the ambush.
The 11th was 48 years old, though the siege had aged him by decades. His beard, once the dark brown of Byzantine tradition, was now streaked with silver that caught the dying light like threads of starlight. His hands, pale from royal blood but calloused now from months of personal involvement in the city's defense, gripped the stone parapet with a strength born of desperation. Below him, Constantinople sprawled in all its ancient glory, its domes and towers creating a silhouette that had remained unchanged for over 1,000 years. The great chain that stretched across the Golden Horn gleamed dully in the sunset, a last defense against the Ottoman fleet that waited just beyond its reach. Somewhere in the maze of narrow streets, a mother was singing her children to sleep. Somewhere, a baker was kneading tomorrow's bread, not knowing if tomorrow would ever come. But Constantine had already made the decision that would define his place in history forever. The emperor descended the narrow stone steps that spiraled down from the tower, each footfall echoing like a heartbeat in the gathering darkness. His purple robes, once symbols of divine authority stretching back to Caesar Augustus himself, now felt heavy as funeral shrouds. The weight of 11 centuries pressed upon his shoulders, and with each step, he felt the accumulated ghosts of all the emperors who had walked these halls before him. Constantine the Great had founded this city. Constantine the Last would watch it fall. In the courtyard below, his advisors waited with the patience of men who had learned that desperate times called for careful words. Their faces, lit by the dancing flames of torches, told him everything he already knew without need for reports or counsels of war. The Ottomans had completed their preparations. Mehmed II's great cannon, the one they whispered could breach any wall that God had ever inspired man to build, was trained on the weakest section of their defenses. "Your Majesty," spoke Gennadios Scholarios, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might bring the enemy walls crashing down around them. "There are ships waiting in the harbor, Genoese vessels. You could still?" Constantine raised his hand, and silence fell over the courtyard like snow. The gesture was small, but it carried the authority of 1,000 years of imperial tradition. When he spoke, his voice carried across the stone like distant thunder rolling across the hills of Anatolia. "A Constantine founded this city," he said, his words measured and calm despite the chaos that surrounded them. "A Constantine will not abandon it." The emperor walked through halls where his ancestors had ruled for over a millennium. Tapestries depicting victories long forgotten hung in shadows that seemed to dance with the flicker of oil lamps. Mosaics of saints and emperors gazed down with golden eyes that seemed to flicker with their own inner light, as if they too understood that they were witnessing the end of an age. These corridors had seen the coronation of dynasties. They had echoed with the whispered conspiracies of palace intrigue, the prayers of the faithful, and the tears of the defeated. They had been walked by Justinian, who had built the greatest church in Christendom. They had sheltered the Palaiologos dynasty through plague and civil war, through the slow, inexorable decline that had brought them to this final moment. As he passed the throne room, Constantine paused at its entrance. The great chair of Byzantine power sat empty in the darkness, its purple cushions undisturbed. He had not sat upon that throne in weeks. What was the point of claiming divine authority when God seemed to have turned his face away from the city that had served him for so long? Through the tall windows that overlooked the city, he could see the Ottoman campfires scattered across the hills beyond the walls like fallen stars. Each flickering light represented hundreds of soldiers, thousands of weapons, an empire ascending while his own drew its final, labored breaths. The contrast was not lost on him. Where once there had been darkness beyond Constantinople's walls, now there was light. The torch had passed to other hands. What Constantine could not know was how profoundly his decision would echo through the centuries that followed. The sound of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as he continued through corridors where emperors had walked since the time of Charlemagne. The palace felt different at night, more ancient somehow, as if the darkness stripped away the veneer of the present and revealed the accumulated weight of all the centuries that lay beneath. In the distance, a bell began to toll. Not the joyful peal of celebration that had once announced imperial births and victories, but the slow, measured rhythm of mourning. The deep bronze voice seemed to carry across the city like the heartbeat of Constantinople itself, growing fainter with each beat. Soon, other bells joined the lament from churches scattered across the 7 hills, until the entire city resonated with the sound of bronze voices crying out to heaven. The anthem of endings had begun. Constantine stepped onto a marble balcony overlooking the great city. Constantinople sprawled before him in the gathering twilight, its ancient beauty undiminished even in these final hours. The dome of Hagia Sophia caught the last rays of sunlight and seemed to glow with an inner fire. The walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years stood proud and defiant, even though he knew that tomorrow they would be tested as they had never been tested before. Lanterns were beginning to flicker to life in windows throughout the city. Somewhere below, families were gathering for what might be their final meal together. Children were being tucked into beds they might never wake up in. Lovers were sharing kisses that might have to last through eternity. The emperor closed his eyes and listened to the symphony of his dying city. The distant sound of prayers drifting from 100 churches, the soft murmur of conversations carried on the evening breeze, the gentle splash of waves against the sea walls that had protected Constantinople's harbors for so many centuries. When he opened his eyes again, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Venus hung low on the horizon, bright and beautiful and eternal, just as she had shone down on Caesar crossing the Rubicon, just as she had watched Alexander march into India. just as she had witnessed the rise and fall of every empire that had ever claimed dominion over the affairs of men. In 12 hours, Constantine knew Venus would still be shining. But the empire over which she had watched for over 1,000 years would exist only in memory. Chapter 2. The Heart of Faith. In the Hagia Sophia, 800 yards from where the emperor stood in contemplation, Patriarch Gennadios II knelt before the great altar in prayer that seemed to rise from the very foundations of his soul. His knees pressed against marble that had been worn smooth by the prayers of millions over the course of 9 centuries, marble that had been quarried from the hills of Asia Minor by craftsmen who had believed they were building for eternity. The cathedral's vast interior stretched above him like heaven itself, its great dome seeming to float unsupported in the darkness, held aloft only by faith and the genius of architects who had learned their craft from angels. Golden mosaics caught and reflected the light of thousands of candles, creating a constellation that mirrored the stars appearing in the sky beyond the ancient walls. The air was thick with frankincense and myrrh, carrying the accumulated prayers of centuries up toward the dome where Christ Pantocrator gazed down with eyes that had watched over Constantinople through plague and earthquake, through triumph and disaster. The mosaic was nearly 900 years old, but tonight those divine eyes seemed to burn with a living intensity, as if they too understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of the world. But what Gennadios was praying for went far beyond the fate of any earthly empire. The patriarch lifted his graying head and spoke the words that had been spoken in this place since the cathedral was first consecrated. Kyrie eleison. Christa eleison. Kyrie eleison. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. The words echoed in the vastness above him, seeming to hang in the air like incense smoke before finally fading into the darkness of the upper galleries. But even as his voice fell silent, he could hear it, the sound that had haunted the city for 57 days and nights. The rhythmic pounding of Ottoman engineers testing their siege equipment echoed across the water, each measured blow seeming to shake the very foundations of the cathedral. Each thud marked another moment closer to an ending that felt as inevitable as the setting of the sun. In the side chapels that surrounded the great nave, families had been gathering since sunset for what they all knew might be their final vigil together. Mothers held sleeping children against their hearts, feeling each precious breath, memorizing the weight of small bodies that might soon be lost forever. Fathers gripped sword hilts with knuckles white from tension, their eyes darting between their families and the great bronze doors, calculating distances and escape routes that everyone knew would prove meaningless when morning came. Grandparents who remembered the last great siege spoke in whispers of other dark nights, other times when the city had seemed doomed but had somehow found deliverance. But their voices lacked the conviction of earlier years, and their eyes held the knowledge that this time was different. This time, the cannons were larger, the enemy more determined, and the defenders far fewer. Brother Marcus, barely 21 years old and 3 years into his novitiate at the monastery of Studium, approached the altar carrying a golden reliquary that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Inside, beneath crystal and precious stones that had been set by craftsmen whose names were lost to history, lay what was said to be a fragment of the true cross, the wood upon which Christ himself had died for the redemption of the world. The relic had been in Constantinople for over 6 centuries, brought from Jerusalem during the time of Emperor Heraclius. It had protected the city through the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, through the Bulgarian raids that had threatened to sweep away the empire in its infancy, through the Avar assault that had nearly succeeded where all others had failed. Yet tonight, even the holiest relics seemed to tremble in the face of what was approaching. As Marcus set the reliquary upon the altar with hands that shook from more than just the weight of the sacred burden, the candlelight throughout the cathedral seemed to dance more vibrantly, as if stirred by an invisible wind. The old monks who had spent their entire lives in service to this place nodded knowingly to one another. Even in the darkest hour, they understood God's presence could still be felt in this sacred space that had been consecrated to his glory. The great bronze doors of the cathedral opened with a groan that seemed to echo from the very heart of the earth, their ancient hinges protesting after nearly a millennium of faithful service. Emperor Constantine entered alone, having left his imperial guard outside in the gathering darkness. He wore not his purple robes of state, but the simple brown habit of a penitent monk, a choice that spoke more eloquently than any royal proclamation about how he viewed these final hours. His face, weathered by months of siege and sleepless nights spent walking the walls and encouraging his people, showed the strain of carrying the hopes and fears of an entire civilization on his shoulders. But there was something else in his expression as well, a kind of peace that came only to those who had made their final decision and found the courage to live with its consequences. The emperor walked slowly down the marble aisle that stretched the length of the cathedral, past crowds of faithful who knelt as he passed, but whose reverence felt different tonight. This was not the awe of subjects before their sovereign, but the gentle respect offered to a man walking willingly toward his appointment with destiny. When Constantine reached the altar, Patriarch Gennadios rose to meet him. No words were exchanged between the two men. None were needed. The patriarch simply placed his weathered hand upon the emperor's head and began to speak the ancient prayers of blessing and protection that had been spoken over rulers and commoners alike since the earliest days of the Christian Empire. As the patriarch's voice rose and fell in the timeless cadences of the Byzantine liturgy, Constantine felt something he had not experienced in many months. Peace. Not the peace of victory or the peace of escape, but the deeper tranquility that comes from accepting one's destiny with grace and facing it without illusion or false hope. The cathedral began to fill with the sound of hundreds of voices joining in the Trisagion, the ancient hymn that had been sung in this place since its earliest days. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. The voices of men and women, young and old, rich and poor, all united in prayer that seemed to lift their common supplication up toward the dome, where it mingled with the smoke of incense and the dreams of generations. But what none of them could foresee was how their prayers would be answered in ways they never could have imagined. As the hymn continued, its melody weaving through the air like golden thread, the boundary between earth and heaven seemed to grow thin in that sacred space. The faces of the mosaics appeared to come alive in the flickering candlelight, and the very stones of the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the ancient chant. Outside, the first watch of the night was beginning. Guards took their positions on walls that had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years. Across the water, Ottoman soldiers prepared their weapons and said their own prayers to the same God, asking for victory in the coming dawn. But here, in the greatest church of Eastern Christendom, time seemed to slow to the rhythm of eternity itself, and for a few precious hours, the faithful could believe that some things truly do endure forever. Chapter 3. The People's Choice. While emperors prayed and patriarchs offered blessings in the soaring spaces of the great cathedral, In the narrow streets below, a different but no less profound drama was unfolding. Anna Komnenos, 19 years old, and the daughter of a master weaver whose family had served the imperial court for 9 generations, sat by her window in the gathering darkness, working by candlelight on what she knew would be her final piece of cloth. Her fingers moved automatically through motions that had become as natural as breathing, passing the shuttle and thread with the rhythm her mother had taught her, and her grandmother had taught her mother, in an unbroken chain that stretched back through centuries of Constantinople's glory. The pattern emerging on her loom was one that had adorned the robes of emperors and patriarchs for as long as anyone could remember. Golden eagles soaring against a field of imperial purple, their wings spread wide, as if they could carry the dreams of Byzantium itself up toward heaven. The work was intricate, demanding, requiring a level of skill that took decades to master. Each thread had to be placed with perfect precision, each color shaded to blend seamlessly with its neighbors, each motif positioned to create the overall harmony that had made Byzantine textiles the wonder of the known world. Under normal circumstances, such a piece would take months to complete. Anna knew she had perhaps 6 hours, but her reasons for continuing her work were more complex than simple devotion to her craft. Outside her workshop window, which looked out onto one of the narrow streets that wound through the quarter where the city's artisans had lived and worked for centuries, she could hear her neighbors preparing for the siege's end. The sounds drifted up to her through the cool night air, like fragments of a dozen different sorrows. Some families were burying their treasures in their courtyards, wrapping precious objects in oiled cloth before consigning them to the earth in hopes that someday, perhaps, someone would return to reclaim them. The soft scraping of shovels against stone created a melancholy rhythm that seemed to mark the passage of their city's final hours. Others were packing whatever they could carry, planning to flee to the harbor when the walls were breached, and hope that some Genoese or Venetian captain might take pity on refugees with enough gold to pay for passage to safety. The sounds of hasty preparation, the rustle of cloth, the clink of coins, the whispered discussions of what to take and what to leave behind, created a counterpoint to the more somber work of burial going on in other courtyards. Still others, like Anna herself, had made the decision to stay. They moved through their homes and workshops with a different kind of purpose, touching familiar objects with the special tenderness reserved for final farewells. These were the people who had been born in Constantinople, whose roots went so deep into the city's ancient soil that the thought of living anywhere else was more frightening than the thought of not living at all. Anna chose to weave. If these were to be her final hours, she would spend them doing what she had been born to do, creating beauty that would outlast the hands that made it, even if only by a few hours. Downstairs in the workshop that occupied the ground floor of their 3-story building, her father, Mikhail, was engaged in his own form of farewell. The Komnenos family had been weavers in Constantinople for 9 generations, their silk and wool decorating the robes of emperors and patriarchs, their patterns copied in workshops from Venice to Baghdad. Tonight, Mikhail was carefully folding each bolt of finished cloth, running his weathered hands over textures that told stories of seasons and celebrations, of baptisms and weddings, of all the ordinary moments that make up the true life of any civilization. What he was really doing was saying goodbye to a way of life that had sustained his family for 3 centuries. Each bolt told its own story. Here was silk the color of spring leaves, woven for the daughter of a shipping magnate who was to be married to the son of a family of goldsmiths, a wedding that would now never take place. There was wool dyed the deep blue of midnight, intended for the winter robes of a monastery, whose monks had fled to Crete when the siege began in earnest. And here, folded with special care, was a length of cloth that represented the height of the family's art, a complex pattern of golden vines and silver doves that had been commissioned for the patriarch himself, intended to adorn the altar of Hagia Sophia during the Easter celebrations. The commission would never be completed now, but the beauty of what they had accomplished together, father and daughter working side by side through the long winter months, was undeniable. In the kitchen that served as the heart of their home, Maria Komnenos was preparing what might be their last meal together as a family. Somehow, through methods that spoke more of miracles than of practical housekeeping, she had managed to acquire fresh bread, olives from the ancient tree that grew in their small courtyard, and even a bottle of wine that they had been saving for Anna's wedding day, a day that might now never come. If these were to be their final hours as a family, Maria was determined that they would be beautiful hours, filled with the love and traditions that had sustained them through good times and bad. She moved through the familiar rituals of meal preparation with a special kind of attention, aware that she might never again feel the smooth weight of her grandmother's wooden spoon in her hands, never again smell the particular combination of herbs and cooking oil that had made this kitchen smell like home for more than 40 years. As the family gathered around their simple wooden table, the same table where 3 generations of Komnenos children had learned their letters and said their prayers, the sounds of the city's preparation filtered through the windows like a symphony of endings. Somewhere in the distance, a mother was singing a lullaby to children who might not live to see another sunset. Somewhere nearby, a priest was chanting evening prayers in a voice that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the ages. Somewhere on the walls that surrounded their neighborhood, guards were walking their rounds on battlements that had protected Constantinople since the time of Constantine the Great. Young Dmitri, barely 16 and the family's only son, had volunteered to join the city's defenders when the final assault began. His mother had sewn protective prayers into the lining of his leather vest, and his father had given him the small knife that had been carried by every Komnenos man for 3 centuries, a blade that had seen service in a dozen different crises, but had never been asked to help defend the city itself. "Promise me," Maria whispered to her son as they shared what might be their last meal together, "that if the walls are breached, you won't try to be a hero. Promise me you'll run and find some way to survive so that our family's story won't end with tomorrow's dawn." Dmitri nodded, but his eyes held the fire of youth that burns brightest when faced with the prospect of noble sacrifice. He had been raised on stories of Byzantine warriors who had held the frontiers against barbarians, who had charged into the ranks of enemies that outnumbered them 10 to 1, who had chosen death before dishonor in a dozen different forgotten battles. The blood of those defenders flowed in his veins, and he could feel it calling to him across the centuries. But what none of them could imagine was how survival itself would require a different kind of heroism. As the family shared their meal in the candlelit kitchen, they could hear the Ottoman cannons being repositioned for the morning's bombardment. Each metallic clang and scrape seemed to count down the moments until dawn, marking time with the precision of some infernal clock that measured not hours, but the heartbeats of an empire in its final agony. But here, in their small home surrounded by the work of their hands and the love of their hearts, time seemed to slow to the rhythm of heartbeats in unison, of shared glances that said everything that words could not express, of the simple miracle of a family choosing to face the unknown together. Anna looked up from the bread she was breaking and spoke the words that had become a family tradition whenever darkness seemed to be closing in around them. "Father," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the kitchen's warmth. "Tell us the story of how our family came to Constantinople." Mikhail smiled, though tears gathered at the corners of his eyes like dewdrops on morning flowers. This was the story he had told 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. Not like a tale from the distant past, but like a prayer for an uncertain future. "It was in the time of Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer," he began, his voice carrying the cadence of a tale polished by countless tellings. "Our ancestor Theodoros was a silk merchant from Thessalonica who came to the great city with nothing but a bag of mulberry seeds, a handful of silkworm cocoons, and a dream that seemed as fragile as spider's silk." As his voice continued, weaving the familiar story through the darkness like golden thread, the sounds of the siege preparation faded into the background, and for a little while longer, the Komnenos family existed in a bubble of warmth and memory that seemed as eternal as the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient courses. Chapter 4. The Sultan's Vision. Across the narrow stretch of water that separated Europe from Asia, in the sprawling Ottoman camp that stretched across the hills beyond Constantinople's ancient walls, Sultan Mehmed II stood before his great cannon in the pre-dawn darkness that pressed down upon the world like a vast, invisible weight. The massive bronze weapon, 27 feet long and capable of firing a stone ball that weighed 1,200 pounds, gleamed dully in the light of the watchfires that burned throughout the camp. The cannon was the product of the most advanced military engineering in the world, designed by Orban, a Hungarian master founder who had offered his services first to the Byzantines before bringing his genius to the Ottoman court when Constantine could not afford to pay for his innovations. Orban ran his hands along the weapon's bronze surface with the tenderness of a father caressing a sleeping child, checking for any signs of stress or weakness that might cause the gun to explode when the final bombardment began. "She is ready, Sultan," he said quietly, his voice carrying the confidence of a master craftsman who understood every nuance of his creation. "Tomorrow, the walls of Constantine will fall like wheat before the scythe." But what drove the young sultan was far more complex than simple military ambition. Mehmed was only 21 years old, but his dark eyes held depths that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated wisdom. He had dreamed of this moment since earliest childhood, when his tutors had filled his imagination with stories of the great city that controlled the passage between Europe and Asia, the city that had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years, while empires rose and fell around it, like waves breaking against an eternal shore. Yet his desire to take Constantinople was not born of simple greed or the lust for conquest that had driven so many rulers before him. Mehmed had been educated by the finest scholars of his age, men who had taught him to read Greek and Latin as fluently as Turkish and Arabic, who had introduced him to the works of Plato and Aristotle, who had helped him understand that true greatness came not from destroying what had come before, but from building upon it. The Sultan began walking through his camp, moving between the rows of sleeping soldiers with the quiet tread of someone who understood that armies were made up not of faceless masses, but of individual men with individual fears and hopes and dreams. Here lay janissaries from the mountains of Anatolia, their distinctive white felt caps set carefully beside their sleeping rolls. There rested Sipahi cavalry from the plains of Thrace, their horses tethered nearby and cropping grass with the peaceful indifference of creatures who knew nothing of human ambitions. Miners from Serbia slept next to siege engineers from Hungary, Cannoneers from Egypt lay wrapped in their cloaks beside infantry from Albania. The Ottoman Empire was a tapestry woven from dozens of different peoples, all united under the green banner of Islam, but carrying within themselves the customs and memories of 100 different traditions. At the edge of the camp, where the watchfires burned lowest and the darkness pressed closest, Mehmed paused at a small tent where his chief astronomer, Ibn Battuta, was bent over his astrolabe, calculating the positions of the stars with the precision that had made Islamic astronomy the wonder of the world. The old man looked up from his instruments as the Sultan approached, his eyes clouded by decades spent gazing into the infinite depths of the night sky, searching for patterns that might reveal God's intentions for the affairs of men. What he had seen in the stars would influence the Sultan's decisions in ways that would echo through history. "The signs are favorable, my Sultan," Ibn Battuta said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent studying the movements of celestial bodies. "Mars ascends in the house of victory, and Jupiter stands in conjunction with the moon. The stars themselves seem to be drawing the scattered threads of fate together toward a single moment of destiny." He hesitated for a moment, and Mehmed could see that there was more the old astronomer wanted to say. "Speak freely, my friend," the Sultan encouraged. "I have always valued your counsel, especially when it carries warnings along with promises." "The stars also show great sorrow, my Sultan," Ibn Battuta continued, his voice growing softer as he spoke. "A light that has burned for 1,000 years is about to be extinguished. Even in victory, especially in victory, there must be mourning for what will be lost. The wise ruler knows that every ending, even a necessary ending, deserves to be grieved." Mehmed nodded thoughtfully. He had studied the history of Constantinople with the same intensity that he had brought to military strategy and statecraft. He had walked through the ruins of ancient Troy, seeing in those scattered stones a reminder that all human achievements, no matter how magnificent, were ultimately temporary. He had read the Greek philosophers in their original language, learning from Plato that the ideal forms of justice and beauty were eternal, even when their earthly manifestations passed away like shadows on a wall. The young Sultan understood that tomorrow he would not merely be conquering a city, but ending a story that stretched back through the mists of history to the very dawn of the Christian era. The weight of that responsibility rested on his shoulders like the cloak of a prophet, heavy with the knowledge of what must come to pass, but sorrowful for the price that history demanded. In his command tent, the largest structure in the entire camp, spread across a low table that had been carved from a single piece of cedar wood, lay the most detailed map of Constantinople ever created. Every wall, every gate, every tower was marked with careful precision. The positions of cisterns and aqueducts were noted, along with the locations of major churches and markets, the routes that connected different quarters of the city, the depths of harbors and the heights of fortifications. Red silk flags showed where his artillery had been positioned to maximum effect. Blue markers indicated the deployment of his fleet, which now controlled the Bosphorus so completely that not even a fishing boat could pass without permission. Green pennants marked the positions of his infantry, arranged in formations that could exploit any breach in the ancient walls with maximum speed and efficiency. But Mehmed's attention was drawn again and again to one particular detail on the map. In the corner of the detailed chart, lovingly rendered in miniature, was a sketch of Hagia Sophia with its soaring dome and graceful proportions, the building that had served as the architectural inspiration for mosques throughout the Islamic world, the church that had been called the eighth wonder of the world when it was completed, almost exactly 1,000 years before. Tomorrow, if God willed it, he would stand in that sacred space and offer prayers of thanksgiving for victory. But he had already decided that when that moment came, it would be a prayer not of triumph, but of transition, an acknowledgement that he was merely the latest in a long line of rulers who had been granted stewardship over this crossroads of the world. As he studied the map in the flickering candlelight, Mehmed could hear the distant sound of bells tolling across the water, carrying the prayers and fears of Constantinople's people on the night breeze. Each chime seemed to mark another moment in the countdown toward dawn, another heartbeat in the final hours of the Byzantine Empire. The young sultan felt the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders with an almost physical force. Tomorrow, he would either become Mehmed the Conqueror, his name written alongside those of Alexander and Caesar in the annals of the great military leaders, or he would join the long and forgotten list of those who had tried and failed to take the Queen of Cities. But more than personal glory or military reputation, what drove him was a vision of what Constantinople could become under Ottoman rule. Not a conquered city stripped of its treasures and left to decay, but a new kind of capital that could serve as a bridge between East and West, a place where the wisdom of antiquity could be preserved and honored, while new forms of learning and art flourished under the protection of a truly universal empire. As the night deepened around his camp, Mehmed continued his preparations for the dawn assault, but his thoughts were already reaching beyond the coming battle toward the work of reconstruction and reconciliation that would follow. He had not come to bury Constantinople, but to resurrect it in a new form that could endure for another 1,000 years. What he could not foresee was how completely his vision would transform not just the city he was about to conquer, but the very nature of empire itself. Chapter 5. The Walls Remember. The Theodosian Wall had stood for more than 1,000 years, a monument to human determination and divine protection that had turned back every army that had dared to challenge its might. Built by Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century of the Christian era, it had withstood earthquakes that had leveled entire districts of the city, sieges by enemies whose names were now forgotten by all but the most learned historians, and the slow, inexorable erosion of time itself. Tonight, as Ottoman cannons prepared for their final devastating bombardment, the ancient stones seemed to whisper with the voices of all who had defended them across the centuries: Roman legionaries and Byzantine soldiers, Varangian guardsmen from the frozen north, and Armenian archers from the mountains of the east, all united by their determination to hold this line between civilization and chaos. The wall rose from the earth like a man-made mountain range, nearly 60 feet high and 15 feet thick at its base, constructed from alternating courses of limestone and brick that created a pattern pleasing to the eye even as it provided strength that had proven equal to every challenge the world could offer. Towers rose at regular intervals, each one a fortress in itself, connected by ramparts wide enough for men and supplies to move freely, even under the heaviest bombardment. But tonight, those ancient defenses were about to face their ultimate test. Captain Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese condottiere, who had volunteered to command the outer wall's defense, walked slowly along the ramparts in the deepening darkness of the final night. His armor, battered by weeks of siege and scarred by fragments of stone hurled by Ottoman artillery, clinked softly with each step he took across stones that had been worn smooth by the passage of countless defenders before him. Giustiniani was 42 years old, a veteran of a dozen different campaigns who had learned his trade in the wars that constantly swept across the Italian peninsula. He had come to Constantinople not for money. The emperor had little enough of that to offer. but because he understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of their likely outcome, because there were principles that deserved to be defended, even when defense seemed hopeless. Each step he took along the wall carried him past positions where his men waited with the quiet patience of soldiers who had made their peace with whatever fate the morning might bring. These were not the professional warriors who made up the bulk of medieval armies, but ordinary citizens of Constantinople who had taken up arms to defend their homes and families. Here was Andreas, a carpenter's son barely 18 years old, who gripped his crossbow with hands that were more accustomed to shaping wood than dealing death. There was Father Demetrios, past 60 and so nearsighted that he could barely make out the enemy positions across the field, but determined to stand with his parishioners in their hour of greatest need. At the next position stood Maria Paleologina, a distant cousin of the emperor himself, who had refused all offers of safe passage and instead chosen to load stones into a catapult with the methodical precision of someone kneading bread for her family's dinner. What Giustiniani saw in their faces was something that no amount of professional military training could create. These defenders were not fighting for conquest or glory or the abstract ideals that motivated professional soldiers. They were fighting for something simpler and more profound, the right to continue being who they were, in the place where they belonged, surrounded by the people and traditions that gave their lives meaning. The wall itself told the story of their city's long struggle for survival. Here was a section that had been rebuilt after the great earthquake of 557, its newer stones slightly different in color from the original construction. There was a tower that bore scars from the Arab siege of 717, when the fate of all Christendom had hung in the balance for more than a year. At another point, the rampart showed signs of hasty repair from the civil wars of the 14th century, when Byzantines had fought Byzantines while their common enemies gathered strength beyond the borders. But the most recent scars were the most ominous. Yesterday's bombardment had created several breaches in the ancient fortification, gaps that Giustiniani's men had worked through the night to repair with whatever materials they could find. Barrels filled with earth, stones salvaged from ruined buildings, even altars taken from churches that had been abandoned when their congregations fled the city. The makeshift repairs looked pitifully inadequate when compared to the massive stone blocks of the original construction, but they represented something more important than military engineering. They were proof that the defenders had not given up, that they were prepared to patch and rebuild and make do with whatever they had for as long as strength remained in their bodies. As the captain continued his inspection, checking each position and offering words of encouragement to defenders who seemed to draw strength from his calm confidence, a low rumble echoed across the plain beyond the walls. The Ottoman cannons were being loaded for the dawn bombardment, each metallic clang and scrape marking another moment in the countdown toward the final assault. The sound seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet, and Giustiniani could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots, transmitted up through the ancient masonry, as if the wall itself were trembling in anticipation of what was to come. But there was something else in that trembling, something that spoke of resolve rather than fear. Young Andreas approached his captain with a water skin, his face pale but determined in the flickering light of the torches that burned along the rampart. The boy could not have been more than 17, but weeks of siege had etched lines around his eyes that spoke of premature aging, of innocence lost in the crucible of war. "Captain," Andreas whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow hasten the approach of dawn. "My mother lives just behind this wall, in the house where I was born. She baked bread for the defenders every day until her flour ran out. Now she sits by her window with her rosary, watching for my return. Giustiniani placed a gauntleted hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor that ran through the young man's frame. "Then we shall make sure you return to her, young friend," he said quietly. "That is what walls are for, not to keep enemies out, but to keep families together." As they spoke, the sound of artillery preparation grew louder and more ominous. The great cannon that the Ottomans called basilica was being carefully aimed at the section of wall that intelligence reports had identified as the most vulnerable point in the entire defensive system. If that massive weapon could create a large enough breach, the flood of Ottoman soldiers that would pour through the gap would be unstoppable. But Giustiniani had spent his career learning that battles were not won by weapons alone, but by the will of the men who wielded them. As he looked around at the faces of his defenders, young and old, male and female, noble and common, all united in their determination to hold the line, he felt a surge of something that was more than mere hope. These people were not defending a wall or even a city. They were defending a way of life that had endured for over 1,000 years, a civilization that had preserved the wisdom of antiquity through the darkest times and passed it on to generations yet unborn. That was a cause worth dying for, and if necessary, Giustiniani was prepared to help them do it with honor. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, the captain gathered his small force around him for what they all knew might be their final conference. 43 men and women, young and old, armed with whatever weapons they had been able to find, preparing to face the concentrated might of an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. "My friends," Giustiniani said, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness that precedes battle, "today we write the final page of a very long and noble story. Let us make sure that when future generations read that page, they will say that we wrote it well, with courage and honor and love for everything that is worth preserving in this world." The defenders nodded solemnly, and each made whatever personal preparations remained to them. Some prayed quietly, others checked their weapons one final time, and a few simply stood in silence, watching the sun rise over the ancient city they had sworn to protect, knowing that this might be the last sunrise they would ever see, but grateful that they had been given the privilege of meeting it in such noble company. Chapter 6. The First Light. The sun rose over Constantinople on May 29, 1453, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise beauty even in the midst of impending tragedy. But the serenity of dawn was shattered by the thunderous roar of Mehmed's great cannon, a sound so vast and terrible that it seemed to shake not just the earth beneath the city's foundations, but the very fabric of heaven itself. The massive stone projectile struck the Theodosian wall with the force of divine judgment, sending shock waves through foundations that had stood firm for a millennium. Ancient mortar crumbled like dust. Blocks of stone that had defied earthquakes and armies shifted and fell with a grinding roar that seemed to come from the throat of some primordial beast awakening from centuries of slumber. The sound echoed across the city like the voice of doom itself, bouncing off the domes and towers of 1,000 churches before finally fading into a silence that felt more ominous than the bombardment itself. In that moment of quiet, every person in Constantinople, from the emperor in his palace to the humblest street sweeper, understood that the final act of their city's long drama was beginning. What none of them could imagine was how many different meanings that ending might hold. In the Hagia Sophia, Patriarch Gennadios felt the great cathedral's foundations tremble beneath his knees as he continued his prayers at the altar that had sanctified the worship of generations. Dust drifted down from the vast dome like gray snow, and the golden mosaics that adorned the walls seemed to shimmer and dance in the candlelight, as if they too trembled before the power that was being unleashed against their city. The patriarch did not pause in his prayers, but his voice seemed to take on new urgency as he spoke the ancient words that had sustained his people through so many trials. Around him, hundreds of families huddled together in the nave, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and faith that spoke to the eternal human struggle to find meaning in the face of forces beyond their control. Emperor Constantine stood on the marble balcony of the great palace, watching smoke rise from the first bombardment like incense from some vast and terrible sacrifice. Each cannon blast that followed the first marked another step toward the end of everything he had been born to protect. But his face remained carved from marble like the statues of his ancestors, showing no trace of the turmoil that must have been raging within his heart. He had made his decision during the long vigil of the night, and now all that remained was to live with its consequences with whatever grace God might grant him. The purple robes of empire felt heavy on his shoulders, but he wore them with dignity, understanding that sometimes the greatest service a ruler could perform was to provide an example of how to face the impossible with courage. But something was stirring in the heart of Constantinople that would surprise everyone, defender and attacker alike. From every quarter of the city, from neighborhoods that had been emptying steadily as the siege tightened its grip, people began to emerge into the morning light. But they were not fleeing, as so many had expected them to do when the final assault began. Instead, they were moving toward the sound of battle, drawn by some instinct deeper than fear or self-preservation. Bakers left their ovens with the morning's bread still baking inside. Weavers abandoned their looms with complex patterns half-finished. Merchants closed their stalls and left their precious goods unguarded. Teachers led their students out of schoolrooms, and mothers carried their babies as they joined the stream of people moving toward the walls that had protected them all for so many years. They came carrying whatever they could use as weapons: kitchen knives and carpenter's hammers, iron tools and walking sticks, anything that might serve to defend their homes and families. But more importantly, they came singing the ancient hymns that their grandparents had taught them, their voices rising together in harmonies that had sustained the Byzantine people through a dozen different crises. Maria Komnenos walked beside her husband and children toward the Great Wall, her weathered hands clutching the family's most precious possession, an icon of the Virgin and Child that had been blessed by 3 different patriarchs and was said to have wept tears of oil during the earthquake of 1346. The icon was small enough to fit in her palm, but it seemed to carry the weight of all her family's hopes for divine protection. Young Dmitri marched with the other volunteers, his mother's prayers sewn into the lining of his leather vest and his father's knife hanging at his side. But it was not weapons that gave him courage as he walked toward his first battle. It was the knowledge that he was following in the footsteps of defenders who had held these same walls against Bulgars and Arabs, Avars and Russians for more than 1,000 years. What they were about to discover was that courage could take forms they had never imagined. At the wall, Captain Giustiniani watched the approaching citizens with amazement that quickly turned to something approaching awe. He had expected perhaps a few dozen volunteers to join his professional soldiers. Instead, hundreds were arriving, old and young, men and women, people from every walk of life carrying the tools of their trades transformed into the weapons of war. Brother Marcus had come from the monastery carrying not only sacred relics, but also a practical knowledge of engineering gained from years spent maintaining ancient buildings. Anna the Weaver brought her shuttle, sharpened to a point, and weighted with lead to serve as a deadly projectile. Even old Father Demetrios, who could barely walk without assistance, arrived carrying holy water to bless the weapons of the faithful. As the Ottoman cannons continued their systematic bombardment, opening new breaches in the ancient fortifications with each devastating impact, the defenders worked together with a coordination that seemed to arise spontaneously from their shared determination. Stones passed from hand to hand in human chains that stretched back into the city. Prayers were whispered over tools and weapons, transforming implements of peace into instruments of sacred defense. Children too young to fight ran water to the workers and carried messages between different sections of the wall. Women who had never touched weapons before in their lives learned to load crossbows and catapults under the patient instruction of grizzled veterans. Priests and scholars took their places beside soldiers and laborers, all united in their determination to hold the line for as long as humanly possible. Constantine himself appeared at the wall as the morning wore on, no longer dressed as an emperor, but as a simple soldier among soldiers. He had exchanged his purple robes for plain armor and taken his place in the line, lifting stones and carrying timber like any other defender. When someone recognized him and began to kneel in respect, he gently raised them up with his own hands. "Today," the last emperor of Byzantium said simply, his voice carrying clearly despite the thunder of artillery, "we are all citizens of Constantinople." The words seemed to crystallize something that had been building in the hearts of the defenders throughout the long weeks of siege. This was not about emperors or empires, about political systems or religious differences. This was about home and family, and the right of people to determine their own destiny in the place where they belonged. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the bombardment continued with relentless fury, the ancient walls of Constantinople began to show more and more signs of damage. But the spirit of resistance only seemed to grow stronger with each breach, fed by the knowledge that they were fighting not just for their own lives, but for something precious that deserved to be preserved regardless of the cost. What none of them could foresee was how their courage would transform the very meaning of victory and defeat. Chapter 7. The First Assault. By mid-morning, the concentrated fire of Ottoman artillery had created 3 major breaches in the Theodosian wall, gaps in the ancient masonry that looked like wounds in the flesh of some enormous beast. Through his field glasses, Sultan Mehmed could see the desperate activity of the defenders as they struggled to repair the damage, their tiny figures moving back and forth like ants, attempting to rebuild a hill that had been kicked apart by a giant's boot. The young sultan raised his hand, and the cannons fell silent with an abruptness that made the sudden quiet seem almost more ominous than the bombardment itself. Across the plain that separated his army from the city's walls, drums began to beat with a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself, calling his soldiers to their positions for the assault that would determine the fate of 2 empires. Banners unfurled in the morning breeze, their bright colors snapping and dancing like living things eager for battle. The crescent flags of the Ottoman Empire caught the sunlight and seemed to burn with an inner fire, while beneath them marched soldiers from every corner of the known world, united in their service to a vision of empire that promised to bridge the gap between East and West. But what the defenders could not see from their positions on the walls was the complexity of emotions that moved through the Ottoman ranks. Hassan, a young soldier from a village near Bursa, whose family had farmed the same plot of land for 12 generations, gripped his spear with hands that trembled slightly as he looked up at the ancient walls of Constantinople. He had joined the Sultan's army not from any great desire for conquest or glory, but because his family needed the silver coins that military service could provide, and because a series of bad harvests had left them with few other choices. Now, as he prepared to assault the greatest city in the world, Hassan found himself filled not with bloodlust, but with something approaching awe. These walls had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years, protecting a civilization that had preserved the wisdom of antiquity through the darkest times in human history. In a few moments, he might be helping to bring that long story to its final conclusion. Beside him, his friend Kamal, a blacksmith's son whose strong arms had been shaped by years of working with hammer and anvil, was thinking of stories his grandfather had told him about Constantinople's legendary libraries. "They say," Kamal whispered as they waited for the order to advance, "that the shelves of the imperial library hold all the wisdom of the ancient world, books by philosophers and poets whose names we've never even heard." "And tomorrow," Hassan replied sadly, understanding the implications of what they were about to do. "Much of it may be nothing but ash scattered on the wind." The attack began with a cloud of arrows that darkened the sky like a flock of ravens, thousands of shafts arcing high above the plain before descending toward the defenders with a sound like hail falling on a tin roof. The Byzantines replied with their own volleys, and the air between the two armies filled with the whistle and thud of projectiles finding their targets in human flesh. But this was only the prelude to the real test of strength that was about to begin. On the walls, Captain Giustiniani moved from position to position with the calm efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for moments like this. He helped aim the few cannons the city possessed, personally assisted in the loading of crossbows, and offered words of encouragement to defenders who drew strength from his unshakable composure in the face of overwhelming odds. An arrow shaft grazed his cheek as he bent to help a wounded crossbowman, leaving a thin line of blood that he ignored completely as he continued his work. Pain was simply another factor to be managed, no more worthy of attention than the weather or the time of day. Young Andreas, the carpenter's son who had never imagined that he would spend his 18th birthday defending the walls of Constantinople, found himself face to face with an Ottoman soldier who had climbed over the rubble of a breach and was now advancing with sword in hand. For a moment, their eyes met across the space that separated them, and Andreas saw that his opponent was no older than himself, just another young man caught up in forces larger than either of them could control or fully understand. Then training took over, and the personal became abstract as Andreas raised his crossbow and did what had to be done. The clash of metal on metal, the shouts of warriors encouraging each other to greater efforts, the cries of the wounded calling for help, all blended into a symphony of war that echoed across the ancient city like thunder rolling down from the mountains. But in the midst of the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. The defenders were not simply fighting for their lives. They were fighting as if they understood that they were the guardians of something precious and irreplaceable. Each stone they lifted to repair a breach was placed with the care of someone tending a sacred shrine. Each arrow they loosed was aimed not just at an enemy, but at the forces of destruction itself. What neither side had anticipated was how the very desperation of the defense would transform the nature of the battle itself. From the towers of Hagia Sophia, the bells continued to ring as they had during every crisis in the city's long history. But now their bronze voices carried a different message. This was not the call to prayer or celebration, but the signal to the faithful that their final hour had arrived and that they should prepare their souls for whatever judgment awaited them on the other side of mortality. Father Georgios, an elderly priest who had served the same small church for 40 years, stood in his bell tower pulling the rope with hands that had grown arthritic from decades of faithful service. Each stroke sent vibrations through his arms and into his chest until he felt as if he were becoming part of the bronze voice that called across the city. Below him, he could see families hurrying through the streets, some fleeing toward the harbors, others moving toward the walls to offer whatever help they could. The priest paused in his bell ringing long enough to whisper a prayer not for victory, but for understanding. "Lord," he said, his words lost in the din of battle that echoed from the walls, "help us to face what comes with grace, and let something of beauty survive whatever ending awaits us." In the great palace, scribes worked frantically to preserve the most important documents of state, copying treaties and chronicles onto parchment that might survive even if the buildings that housed them were burned to the ground. The imperial crown was wrapped in silk and hidden in a secret chamber that had been prepared for just such an emergency. The greatest treasures of Byzantium were sealed away in tombs that were disguised to look like ordinary storage rooms, in the hope that someday, perhaps, they might again see the light and serve to remind the world of what had been lost. Nikephoros, the chief librarian of the imperial collection, moved through the halls of learning with the methodical pace of a man performing a sacred ritual. Each manuscript he selected for preservation had been chosen not just for its rarity or monetary value, but for its ability to carry the essence of Byzantine civilization forward into an uncertain future. Here was a copy of the Iliad with marginal notes by scholars whose names had been forgotten for centuries. There was a treatise on mathematics that had been translated from Arabic into Greek during the time of the Crusades, representing the kind of intellectual exchange that had made Constantinople a bridge between worlds. And here, wrapped in purple silk, was a collection of hymns that had been sung in Hagia Sophia since the cathedral's earliest days, melodies that carried within them the prayers and hopes of countless generations. But even as the first assault raged with unprecedented fury, Constantine remained on the wall, fighting beside a blacksmith and a baker, as if he were simply another citizen defending his home. The emperor had removed the last symbols of his imperial rank, transforming himself from a ruler into something both simpler and more profound, a man standing with his people at the moment of their greatest trial. His sword, an ancient blade that had been carried by his ancestors in battles against Bulgars and Arabs, caught the morning sunlight as he moved from breach to breach, helping to coordinate the defense with the calm authority of someone who had found peace with his destiny. Beside him, Theodoros the baker wielded a wooden mallet with the same precision he had once used to shape loaves of bread. The tool felt familiar in his hands, but its purpose had been transformed by necessity into something he had never imagined. Maria, a widow whose husband had died in a plague 3 years earlier, loaded stones into a catapult with her 2 teenage sons, their movements coordinated by months of practice and a shared understanding that they were defending not just their city, but their right to continue existing as the people they had chosen to become. The first Ottoman assault continued for 3 hours, wave after wave of soldiers throwing themselves against defenses that seemed to grow stronger with each attack. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed it. The very act of trying to destroy the walls seemed to strengthen the resolve of those who defended them. The spaces before the breaches became carpeted with the bodies of attackers who had died in the attempt to break through. But an equal number of defenders had fallen as well. Captain Giustiniani could see in the faces of his people the exhaustion that would make the next assault even more dangerous than the first. But he could also see something else that gave him hope, a kind of fierce joy that came from the knowledge that they had proven themselves worthy of the city they served. Yet what surprised everyone was how the act of resistance itself seemed to transform the defenders in ways that went far beyond the merely military. Anna Komnenos, the weaver's daughter who had chosen to complete her final tapestry rather than flee, found herself at the walls during the first assault, carrying water to the defenders and helping to tend the wounded. She had never imagined herself capable of looking upon the injuries of war without flinching, but necessity had awakened skills she did not know she possessed. As she knelt beside a young Genoese sailor who had taken an arrow in the shoulder, Anna found herself thinking not about the horror of his wound, but about the extraordinary courage it had taken for him to leave his ship and climb onto the walls to fight beside people who did not even speak his language. The tapestry she had been weaving seemed to take on new meaning as she worked. It was not just a record of imperial glory, but a testament to the kind of human solidarity that could emerge from the crucible of shared danger. When Sultan Mehmed finally called the retreat, signaling the end of the first assault with horn blasts that echoed across the field of battle, something had indeed changed in the dynamic between the two armies. The Ottomans had expected the city to fall quickly once the walls were breached, but instead, they had encountered a kind of resistance that could not be measured in terms of soldiers and weapons alone. The walls of Constantinople had held, but more importantly, the spirit of Constantinople had revealed itself to be something far more complex and enduring than anyone had imagined. The city had proven that it would not die easily, and that its final chapter would be written in terms that transcended the simple categories of victory and defeat. As the Ottoman forces pulled back to regroup and tend their wounded, and the defenders used the brief respite to strengthen their positions and count their losses, both sides began to understand that they were participating in something larger than an ordinary siege. They were witnessing the transformation of a city and its people, a metamorphosis that would continue regardless of which flag flew over the palace when the sun set on this momentous day. The first assault was over, but the real battle, the battle for the soul of Constantinople, was only beginning. Chapter 8. The Quiet Between Storms. In the strange stillness that followed the retreat of the first Ottoman assault, Constantinople seemed to exist in a space between worlds, no longer the secure imperial capital it had been that morning, but not yet fallen into the hands of its enemies. The silence was broken only by the groans of the wounded, the scrape of stone being moved to repair breaches, and the distant sound of Ottoman war drums echoing across the plain. Captain Giustiniani used this precious respite to walk among his defenders, assessing both their physical condition and their state of mind. What he discovered surprised him. Despite the ferocity of the attack they had just survived, despite the exhaustion that marked every face and the wounds that marked many bodies, there was something in the eyes of these people that had not been there at dawn. It was not confidence. They all understood too well the overwhelming odds they faced. Nor was it the reckless bravery of those who no longer care whether they live or die. Instead, it was something deeper and more sustainable. The quiet satisfaction that comes from having discovered what one is truly capable of when everything depends upon it. But this transformation was not limited to the defenders on the walls. Throughout the city, the first assault had awakened something that had been sleeping in the hearts of Constantinople's people. In workshops and markets, in churches and homes, citizens who had spent weeks debating whether to flee or stay were making their final decisions. not based on rational calculations of their chances for survival, but on a deeper understanding of who they were and where they belonged. Theodoros Lascaris, a merchant whose family had traded in silk and spices for 3 generations, stood in his shop surrounded by goods that represented the accumulated wealth of decades. Bolts of silk from China lay beside jars of pepper from India. Venetian glass shared shelf space with Persian carpets. Syrian perfumes nestled next to Byzantine goldwork. It was a collection that represented not just commercial success, but the cosmopolitan character that had made Constantinople the crossroads of 3 continents. His wife, Elena, entered the shop carrying a small leather satchel, the bag they had prepared for flight, containing only the most portable valuables and the family's most precious documents. For weeks, they had planned to board a Genoese ship at the first sign that the city might fall. Now, with Ottoman forces regrouping for what might be the final assault, that moment had arrived. But Theodoros found himself unable to move toward the door. Instead, he stood touching the familiar surfaces of his trade, feeling the smooth coolness of silk, the rough texture of wool, the smooth hardness of carved jade. These objects told the story of a world that had existed for centuries, a world where Greek Christians and Muslim Turks, Italian Catholics and Armenian Orthodox, Jewish scholars and Hindu merchants had all found ways to live and work together under the protection of Byzantine law and custom. What he was really contemplating was not just his own survival, but the survival of a way of life that had taken centuries to evolve. "Theodoros," Elena said gently, understanding the struggle taking place in her husband's mind. "The ship will not wait much longer. If we are going to leave, we must leave now." He turned to look at her. This woman who had shared his life for 23 years, who had borne his children and mourned their losses, who had built with him the small empire of trade and family that represented their contribution to the great city's prosperity. In her eyes, he could see both her love for him and her willingness to accept whatever choice he made, even if it meant they would face the unknown together rather than seeking safety in flight. "What kind of men would we be?" he asked finally. "If we abandoned our home the moment it needed us most? What would we tell our grandchildren, if God grants us the gift of seeing them grow, about the day their city fell and we were not here to share its fate?" Elena set down the leather satchel and moved to stand beside her husband. Together, they began the work of preparing their shop not for abandonment, but for siege. If Ottoman soldiers were going to loot their goods, they would at least find them properly organized and cataloged. If their building was going to be occupied by strangers, it would be left clean and orderly. If these were to be their final hours in the place they had called home, those hours would be spent maintaining the standards of dignity and care that had guided their lives. Similar scenes were playing out across Constantinople as the morning hours passed. In the scriptorium of the monastery of Studium, Brother Marcus continued his work of copying manuscripts, but now with a different purpose. Instead of simply preserving texts for future generations of Byzantine scholars, he was creating copies that might somehow survive the fall of the city and carry the wisdom of the East to libraries in the West. The young monk worked with feverish intensity, his pen flying across parchment as he transcribed passages from the Fathers of the Church, fragments of ancient philosophy, and excerpts from the great theological debates that had shaped Christian thought for 1,000 years. His hands were stained with ink, his back ached from bending over his writing desk, but he continued working as if his pen could somehow hold back the tide of change that was flowing toward the city. Brother Maximos, the elderly librarian who had become Marcus's mentor during his years in the monastery, approached with a cup of watered wine and a piece of bread. "My son," he said gently, "you cannot copy our entire library in a single morning. Perhaps it is time to accept that some things must pass away so that other things can be born." Marcus looked up from his work, his young face marked by the strain of the past weeks, but his eyes still bright with purpose. "Father," he replied, "I know that I cannot save everything. But if I can preserve even a few pages that might otherwise be lost, if I can ensure that some fragment of our tradition survives to be discovered by scholars in the years to come, then this day will not be an ending, but a beginning." The old monk smiled and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Then copy what you will, but do not forget to live as well. The words we preserve are important, but the spirit that gives them meaning is what truly matters. Whether Constantinople falls today or stands for another 1,000 years, that spirit will endure if we remain faithful to it." And so the city prepared for what all believed would be its final trial. In the narrow streets near the harbor, Dimitri Komnenos made his way toward his family's workshop, his armor stained with blood and dust from the morning's fighting. The young man who had left home before dawn to take his place among the city's defenders was returning fundamentally changed by what he had experienced on the walls. He had seen men die for ideas that were larger than themselves. He had watched his neighbors, people he had known since childhood, reveal depths of courage and determination that he had never suspected. He had discovered that he himself was capable of actions that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The boy who had worried about disappointing his parents had become a man who understood that some disappointments were worth earning. When he reached the workshop, he found his family waiting for him with expressions that mingled relief at his safety with concern about what his return might mean. If he was here instead of on the walls, did that mean the city had fallen? Had the defenders been overwhelmed while they waited in ignorance? "The first assault is over," Dimitri told them simply. "The walls held, but there will be another attack, probably before noon. I came to..." He paused, searching for words to express what he had come to say. What he was struggling to articulate was nothing less than the discovery of his own identity. "I came to tell you that I love you all," he continued finally, "and to say that if these are our last hours together, I want to spend them not as a boy who needs protection, but as a man who can offer it. Whatever happens next, we will face it together as a family." Anna looked up from the loom where she had returned to work on her tapestry, her hands moving in the ancient rhythm that connected her to generations of women who had created beauty even in the midst of chaos. "Then help me finish this," she said, gesturing toward the pattern that was emerging under her skilled fingers. "If our story is going to end today, let us at least make sure that it ends beautifully." The family gathered around the loom, each contributing what skills they possessed to the completion of the work that had become their collective prayer. Mikhail, the master weaver, guided the placement of the golden threads that formed the eagle's wings. Maria, his wife, helped to blend the purple dyes that gave the background its imperial richness. Dimitri, despite his lack of experience with the loom, proved surprisingly adept at the careful work of setting the finest details. As they worked together in the quiet of their workshop, they could hear the sounds of Ottoman preparation drifting across the water, the creak of siege engines being repositioned, the shouts of officers organizing their troops, the rhythmic hammering of smiths making last-minute repairs to weapons and armor. Each sound was a reminder that their peaceful moment was temporary, that forces beyond their control were preparing to resume the work of destruction. But here, in the space they had created together through years of shared labor and mutual care, time seemed to slow to the rhythm of their breathing, the steady movement of shuttles and threads, the whispered conversations that carried all the love and hope and memory that had accumulated within these walls. And in workshops and homes throughout Constantinople, similar scenes of quiet preparation were taking place. At the Church of the Holy Apostles, Father Nikephoros led his small congregation in prayers that had been spoken in that place for over 800 years. The church was not one of the great cathedrals that attracted imperial attention and foreign visitors, but it had served the spiritual needs of several generations of ordinary families, the bakers and weavers, smiths and shopkeepers who formed the essential backbone of the city's life. The congregation that morning was smaller than usual, but those who had come seemed to possess a special intensity of devotion. These were people who had chosen to spend what might be their final hours, not in flight or preparation for battle, but in the familiar rhythms of worship that had sustained them through every previous crisis. Old Maria Cantacuzenios, whose husband had died in the plague 15 years earlier, knelt in her accustomed place near the front of the church. Her arthritic knees sent shoots of pain through her legs with each movement, but she had been kneeling in this same spot every morning for decades, and she was not going to let the fall of an empire interrupt her conversation with God. Beside her, the young mother Sophia held her infant son against her chest, feeling his breathing and heartbeat as counterpoints to the ancient melodies that filled the church. The baby had been born just 3 months earlier, during the worst period of the siege, when food was scarce and the future seemed more uncertain than ever. But looking at his perfect features, feeling the weight of his small body in her arms, Sophia found herself filled not with despair, but with wonder at the persistence of life, at the way hope could take root, even in the most unlikely circumstances. What these people were discovering, as Constantinople prepared for its final trial, was that some things truly are worth dying for. The prayers that morning carried a special weight, as if each word were being carefully weighed and measured before being offered up to heaven. When Father Nikephoros spoke the ancient words of the liturgy, "Lord, have mercy," the response from the congregation seemed to rise from the very depths of their souls, carrying with it not just their fear for the future, but their gratitude for all that had been beautiful in the past. As the service continued, the sound of Ottoman war drums grew louder and more insistent, marking time like the heartbeat of some enormous beast preparing to spring. But within the walls of the small church, surrounded by icons that had been painted by artists whose names were forgotten, but whose faith lived on in every brushstroke, the people of Constantinople found the strength to face whatever the next hours might bring. The quiet between storms was ending, but it had served its purpose. Across the city, individuals and families had used this precious time to discover who they really were and what they truly valued. When the second assault began, they would face it not as victims of historical forces beyond their control, but as people who had consciously chosen to stand with their city in its hour of greatest need. The transformation of Constantinople was accelerating, but it was not the transformation that either the attackers or the defenders had expected. Something new was being born in the space between the old world and the new, something that would outlast the fall of empires and the rise of new powers. The bells of Hagia Sophia began to toll again, but now their bronze voices carried a different message. This was not a call to flight or a lament for the dying, but a declaration that some things endure beyond the reach of conquest, beyond the power of any earthly force to destroy or diminish. The quiet between storms was over. The second and final assault was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Second Wave. Sultan Mehmed II stood before his assembled commanders in the largest tent of his encampment, studying the reports that had been brought to him by his scouts and engineers. The first assault had taught him valuable lessons about the nature of the enemy he faced, lessons that would shape his strategy for what he was determined would be the final attack on Constantinople's walls. "The breaches are wider now," reported Orban, the Hungarian engineer who had designed the great cannon that was the centerpiece of the Ottoman artillery. "My guns have done their work well, but the defenders repair the damage almost as quickly as we can create it. They fight not like soldiers following orders, but like parents defending their children." Zaganos Pasha, the Sultan's chief military advisor, nodded grimly. "I have seen many cities under siege, my Sultan, but never have I witnessed resistance quite like this. They fight with a desperation that makes them dangerous, but also with a discipline that makes them effective. We cannot expect them to break easily." But Mehmed had been thinking about more than just military tactics during the respite between assaults. The young Sultan walked to the edge of his tent and looked out across the plain toward the ancient walls of Constantinople. In the morning light, the city looked exactly as it had been described to him by scholars and travelers throughout his childhood: magnificent, proud, seemingly eternal. Yet he knew that appearances could be deceiving, that even the mightiest fortifications were ultimately temporary obstacles to the forces of historical change. "Tell me," he said to his assembled officers, "what do you think we are really fighting for? What is the true value of the city that lies before us?" The question seemed to catch his commanders by surprise. They had been expecting discussions of tactics and timing, not philosophy and purpose. But Mehmed had always been a ruler who understood that wars were won or lost as much in the realm of ideas as in the clash of arms. Halil Pasha, an elderly commander who had served Mehmed's father and grandfather, was the first to respond. "We fight for the glory of the empire, my Sultan. Constantinople commands the passage between Europe and Asia. Its harbors control the trade routes that connect 3 continents. Its capture will make us the masters of both land and sea." "True enough," Mehmed replied. "But what of its libraries? What of its craftsmen? What of the 1,000 years of learning and artistry that its walls protect? Are these things to be destroyed in our pursuit of strategic advantage?" Zaganos Pasha shifted uncomfortably. The Sultan's questions seemed to be leading toward conclusions that might complicate the straightforward business of conquest. "My Sultan," he said carefully, "the fate of the conquered is always in the hands of the conqueror. You will decide what is preserved and what is discarded." But Mehmed had already made decisions that would surprise both his own soldiers and the defenders of the city. "No," the Sultan said firmly. "We are not conquerors in the old sense, burning and looting and then moving on to the next target. We are the builders of a new kind of empire, one that grows stronger by incorporating the wisdom of those it defeats rather than by destroying it. Constantinople will not be sacked when it falls. It will be transformed." He turned back to face his commanders, his dark eyes reflecting a vision that few of them had anticipated. "Send word to all unit commanders. Any soldier who engages in unauthorized looting or destruction will face immediate punishment. Any civilian who surrenders peacefully is to be treated with respect. Any scholar, artist, or craftsman who agrees to serve our empire will be welcomed with honor. We are not barbarians seeking to destroy civilization. We are the inheritors of civilization, adding our own chapter to its long story." The tent fell silent as the full implications of the Sultan's words sank in. This was not the kind of conquest that any of them had experienced before. They were being asked not just to defeat an enemy, but to preserve what was valuable in that enemy, while transforming it into something new. Ali Pasha, a young commander who had risen through the ranks on the strength of his military skills rather than his political connections, finally spoke. "My Sultan, your vision is ambitious, but will our soldiers understand it? Will they accept that they are to risk their lives for a city they cannot plunder?" Mehmed smiled, and for a moment he looked less like a conqueror planning the fall of an empire and more like a teacher explaining a difficult but important lesson to his students. "That is why we will achieve something that no conqueror before us has achieved. When our soldiers enter Constantinople, they will not be looters or destroyers, but the advance guard of a new age. History will remember them not as the men who ended the Byzantine Empire, but as the men who began something unprecedented." Meanwhile, behind the walls that Mehmed's forces prepared to assault, the defenders were making their own preparations for what they knew would be the final test. Captain Giustiniani had used the brief respite to reorganize his forces and redistribute his remaining supplies. The first assault had cost him nearly a third of his effective fighting strength, but the survivors had proven themselves to be fighters of exceptional quality. More importantly, the morning's battle had attracted volunteers from throughout the city, men and women who had started the day as civilians and were ending it as members of the city's garrison. "We cannot hold another assault like the first one," Giustiniani told his lieutenants frankly. "Our ammunition is running low, our walls are badly damaged, and our people are exhausted. But we have something that the enemy does not expect. We have nothing left to lose, and that makes us more dangerous than any professional army." Andreas, the young carpenter who had discovered his courage in the morning's fighting, raised his hand tentatively. "Captain, what happens when the walls are finally breached? Do we retreat to the citadel? Do we try to break through to the harbor?" Giustiniani looked at the earnest young face, remembering his own first battle and the mixture of fear and excitement that had carried him through it. "We do what soldiers have always done when facing impossible odds, my young friend. We stand where we are needed most, and we make the enemy pay the highest possible price for every step forward. Whether we win or lose is in God's hands, but how we fight is in ours." But the most remarkable preparations were taking place not among the professional soldiers, but among the ordinary citizens who had chosen to remain in the city. Throughout Constantinople, families and communities were organizing themselves into informal units of mutual support and defense. In the quarter where the silk merchants lived, Theodoros Lascaris had emerged as an informal leader, coordinating the distribution of food and water to those who needed it most. In the artisans' district, Mikhail Komnenos was teaching his neighbors how to construct makeshift barricades using the materials of their trades. Looms could be overturned to block narrow streets. Bales of wool could absorb the impact of arrows and stones. Even the great vats used for dyeing cloth could be turned into obstacles that would slow the advance of enemy soldiers. Anna Komnenos had finally completed her tapestry, and the result was extraordinary. The golden eagles that soared across its purple background seemed to glow with their own inner light, as if the threads had been woven not just with silk and wool, but with hope itself. But more remarkable than its beauty was what Anna chose to do with it. Instead of hiding the tapestry away in hopes that it might survive the coming battle, she carried it to the nearest guard post on the wall and hung it from one of the towers where it could be seen by both attackers and defenders. "If this is to be our last day," she told the soldiers who helped her secure the fabric against the wind. Let them see what we are capable of creating, not just what we are capable of destroying. The effect of her gesture spread throughout the defensive positions, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Other citizens began bringing their own creations to the walls. A goldsmith contributed a religious icon that gleamed in the sunlight like a captured star. A manuscript illuminator brought a book of hours whose pages had been decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the breeze. A musician positioned himself in one of the towers and began to play melodies that had been composed for imperial celebrations, the notes carrying across the battlefield like prayers made audible. Sultan Mehmed, observing these developments through his field glasses, found himself both puzzled and impressed by what he was witnessing. He had expected to face the desperate resistance of a dying empire, but instead, he was confronting something unprecedented. A city that was revealing its essential character precisely because it was under mortal threat. "Look at them," he said to Zaganos Pasha, handing him the field glasses. "They are not just defending walls and buildings. They are defending an idea of what a city can be, what a civilization can become when it refuses to be defined by fear." Zaganos Pasha studied the walls for a long moment before returning the glasses to his sultan. "It is impressive, my lord, but it will not save them from our cannons." "No," Mehmed agreed, "but it proves that what we are conquering is worth conquering. When this battle is over, we will not just be the masters of a strategic position or the owners of a collection of buildings. We will be the inheritors of something that has taken centuries to create and that cannot be replaced if it is destroyed." As noon approached and both armies completed their final preparations, the nature of the coming battle had become clear to all participants. This would not be a conventional siege, where professional soldiers fought over military objectives until one side or the other achieved decisive advantage. Instead, it would be a clash between two different visions of what empire could mean, two different understandings of how conquerors and conquered might relate to each other in a world where old certainties were giving way to new possibilities. The Ottomans would fight not just to capture a city, but to prove that their vision of a diverse, cosmopolitan empire could succeed where previous forms of rule had failed. The Byzantines would fight not just to preserve their independence, but to demonstrate that some things were worth defending regardless of the odds, that the human spirit could transcend the merely practical calculations of politics and war. When the second assault began, it would be conducted with the full knowledge, on both sides, that they were participating in something larger than a military engagement. They were helping to determine what kinds of values would shape the future, what kinds of dreams would inspire the next chapter in the long story of human civilization. The bells of Hagia Sophia tolled once more, their bronze voices carrying across the city and the Ottoman encampment with equal clarity. In a few more hours, those same bells might be calling the faithful to prayer in a very different language, serving a very different understanding of the divine. But for now, they spoke for all those who believed that some things endure beyond conquest, beyond the rise and fall of empires, beyond the power of any earthly force to destroy or diminish. The second wave was about to break against the walls of Constantinople. But whatever its outcome, the world would never be quite the same again. Chapter 10. The Crucible of Faith. In the Hagia Sophia, as the sound of Ottoman war drums grew louder and more insistent, Patriarch Gennadios prepared for what might be the final liturgy ever celebrated in the greatest church of Eastern Christendom. The vast cathedral was more crowded than it had been since the great festivals of the empire's glory days, filled with families who had come seeking not just divine protection, but the comfort of sharing their fears and hopes with others who understood the magnitude of what they were facing. The air was thick with incense and the accumulated prayers of centuries, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of time, in a space where the mortal concerns of siege and battle felt distant and somehow less important than the eternal questions that had always been at the heart of human existence. But what was taking place in the cathedral went far beyond the conventional rituals of worship. As the patriarch began the ancient liturgy, his voice carrying clearly throughout the vast space, something extraordinary began to happen. The social distinctions that normally separated the congregation, nobles from commoners, merchants from laborers, Greeks from the various foreign communities that had made Constantinople their home, began to dissolve in the face of their shared vulnerability. Emperor Constantine knelt in the front ranks, not on a special platform or throne, but on the same marble floor as everyone else, his presence distinguished only by the dignity with which he bore the weight of his impossible situation. Beside him knelt Anna Komnenos, the weaver's daughter, whose final tapestry still flew from one of the city's towers. Behind them, Theodoros the merchant prayed next to a Genoese sailor whose ship had been trapped in the harbor when the siege began. The liturgy that morning had a special intensity, as if every word were being weighed and measured before being offered up to heaven. When the congregation responded to the patriarch's prayers with the ancient formula, "Lord, have mercy," their voices seemed to carry not just their immediate fears, but the accumulated hope and faith of all who had worshipped in this place during its 9 centuries of existence. Brother Marcus, the young monk who had spent the morning copying manuscripts in a desperate attempt to preserve what could be preserved, found himself standing next to Elena Lascaris, the merchant's wife, who had chosen to remain in the city, despite the opportunity to flee. Neither spoke, but both drew strength from the presence of the other, from the knowledge that they were not alone in their determination to face whatever came with dignity and grace. What was emerging in the cathedral was a new understanding of what it meant to be part of a community under ultimate threat. As the liturgy continued, Patriarch Gennadios began to speak words that had not been part of the traditional service, words that seemed to flow directly from his understanding of the moment they were all living through. "My children," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space, "we gather this morning not knowing what the next hours will bring. Some of us may see the sunset, others may not. But all of us have the privilege of facing this uncertainty together, as members of a community that has been blessed to exist in this place, in this time, for purposes that only God fully understands." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces before him, seeing in their expressions the full range of human response to crisis: fear and courage, despair and hope, resignation and determination, all mingled together in proportions that shifted from moment to moment, like light playing across water. "For over 1,000 years," the patriarch continued, "this cathedral has been a place where heaven and earth meet, where the prayers of mortals rise toward the divine, and the grace of God descends to comfort and strengthen those who seek it. That will not change, regardless of what flag flies over our city tomorrow, regardless of what language is spoken in our streets, regardless of what forms of government replace the ones we have known." His words seemed to reach something deeper than fear, something that had sustained the people of Constantinople through all the previous crises of their long history. We are not just defending walls and buildings today, Gennadios said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. We are not just preserving a political system or maintaining the privileges of a particular class of people. We are standing witness to the truth that some things have value beyond their usefulness, that some things deserve to be cherished and protected simply because they are beautiful, or true, or good. Emperor Constantine rose from his knees and stepped forward to stand beside the patriarch. For a moment, the two men, the temporal and spiritual leaders of what remained of the Byzantine Empire, stood together in silence before the great altar, their presence a living symbol of all that their people had been and all that they hoped to remain, regardless of what the future might hold. Patriarch, Constantine said finally, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cathedral, will you bless us once more? Not as emperor and subjects, but as Christians preparing to face whatever test God has prepared for us. Gennadios placed his hands on Constantine's head and spoke the ancient words of blessing, but his prayer was directed toward the entire congregation, toward all those who had chosen to remain in the city and share its fate, rather than seeking safety in flight. As the blessing was pronounced, something remarkable happened throughout the cathedral. One by one, members of the congregation began to approach the altar, not to receive communion. That sacred ritual belonged to the regular cycle of the liturgy, but simply to touch the marble rail that separated the sanctuary from the nave, to make physical contact with this place that had been the spiritual heart of their civilization for so many centuries. They came not in order of rank or precedence, but simply as individuals moved by the desire to participate in this moment of collective recognition and farewell. Anna Komnenos knelt and placed her hands flat against the cool marble, feeling through her palms the vibrations of the building itself, the accumulated resonance of countless prayers and ceremonies and moments of profound spiritual significance. Young Dmitri stood beside his sister, his armor still stained with blood and dust from the morning's fighting, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to touch the altar rail. He had come here as a boy countless times, but now he was saying goodbye to childhood itself, accepting the adult understanding that some things end and cannot be preserved except in memory and in the example they provide for those who come after. Theodoros and Elena Lascaris approached together, their merchant's practical understanding of the world's transience made deeper and more poignant by the spiritual framework within which they had learned to view their lives. They had built a successful business, raised children, contributed to their community's prosperity. But all of those achievements seemed less important now than this final act of bearing witness to the values that had shaped their city's character. As more and more people approached the altar, the cathedral began to feel less like a place of worship and more like a space where the essential meaning of community was being revealed. The Genoese sailors and Venetian merchants who had been trapped in the city by the siege knelt beside the Greek families who had lived in Constantinople for generations. The Armenian and Jewish communities that had found refuge within the empire's borders stood next to the Italian scholars who had come to study Byzantine manuscripts. The servants and laborers who kept the city functioning shared this moment with the nobles and officials who governed it. For perhaps the first time in the cathedral's long history, it truly contained all of Constantinople's people, united not by shared beliefs or common origins, but by their collective decision to remain in the place they had made their home, and to face whatever consequences that decision might bring. Brother Marcus found himself weeping, but not from fear or sorrow. Instead, his tears came from recognition, the recognition that he was witnessing something that transcended the political and military events taking place beyond the cathedral's walls. He was seeing the emergence of a new kind of human solidarity, one that could exist even in the face of ultimate defeat, even when all conventional sources of hope had been exhausted. As the ceremony reached its climax, Patriarch Gennadios spoke words that would be remembered by all who heard them, whether they survived the day or not. "My children," he said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his office and his faith, "we do not know what the coming hours will bring. We do not know whether our city will stand or fall, whether our empire will continue or pass into history, whether we ourselves will see another sunrise. But we know this: we have lived in one of the most beautiful cities ever created by human hands. We have been part of one of the most enduring civilizations ever established by human will, and we have loved and been loved in return." He raised his arms in the ancient gesture of blessing, and his voice seemed to fill every corner of the vast cathedral as he continued. "Whatever happens to our bodies, whatever happens to our buildings, whatever happens to our political arrangements, that love and that beauty and that endurance are beyond the reach of any earthly power to destroy. They have become part of the eternal order of things, and they will continue to inspire and comfort and guide human beings long after we are gone." The silence that followed his words was so complete that the only sounds were the distant beating of Ottoman drums and the whisper of wind through the cathedral's high windows. But it was not the silence of endings. It was the silence of recognition, the silence that comes when people understand that they have been granted the privilege of participating in something larger and more meaningful than their individual lives. When the congregation finally began to disperse, moving quietly toward the bronze doors that would take them back into the world of siege and battle, they carried with them something that had not been there when they entered. They carried the knowledge that they belonged to a community that was defined not by its ability to defend itself against attack, but by its commitment to values that transcended survival itself. The second assault would begin soon, and it would test their courage and their skill and their determination to the utmost limit. But they would face it as people who had already won the most important victory, the victory over despair, the victory over the temptation to measure their lives only in terms of their duration rather than their meaning. The bells of Hagia Sophia tolled once more as the last members of the congregation made their way toward the doors. But now, those bronze voices seemed to carry a different message. Not a call to battle or a lament for the dying, but a declaration that some things endure beyond the reach of conquest, beyond the power of any earthly force to diminish or destroy. The crucible of faith had done its work. Whatever happened next, the people of Constantinople would meet it as a community united not by fear, but by love, not by desperation, but by hope, not by the desire to preserve the past, but by the determination to bear witness to the future.